many members of the audience are born in Australia?
None of us.
Okay. So I thought I'd have at least one other Australian, but I'll still start off my opening line. We have been staying at the Quest Eastern Kilders, which is the Kimberley guest house. So I don't know, if you want me to, I can report back on those Jews of Kimberley and the influence of Diamond Joe Gutnick, but I prefer to speak about South Africa this morning. So welcome. It's really great to be here, and this is my final good presentation. So I come from a place called Vryburg, which is in the northwest province of South Africa, not too far from Dar.
You are going to talk about Kimberley, actually.
Yeah, of course.
If you're talking about Dar, we're leaving.
Oh, sorry, not too far from Kimberley, I apologize. So if one looks at the South African map, Eli made a joke earlier that Vryburg isn't on the weather report, but there is Vryburg. Can you see Kuruman, Vryburg, Mafeking? Okay.
What's in Umhlanga?
Umhlanga is just next to Durban, but let's focus.
No, it's
Sorry,
not.
I just don't know what Impangeni is.
Empangeni is in KwaZulu-Natal, but let's focus on the center of South Africa. You can see Kimberley right there. I grew up 2 hours from there. As I said yesterday, I was the last bar mitzvah at the Simon Liebethal Guild Hall in Vryburg. Growing up, I used to go to the doctor in Kimberley. If I'd be nice to my mom, she'd take me shopping there because Kimberley was the bigger town. But we didn't have much to do with the Jewish community. The Jews who lived between Kimberley and Vryburg would actually come to Vryburg during the high holy days. They said our community was more warm. My brothers, I was privileged to have a Jewish day school education. So I went to school at King David in Johannesburg and then Hertz in Cape Town. My brothers actually matriculated at Kimberley Boys High, and they weren't always warmly received by the Jewish community there, maybe because they were naughty. So growing up, I didn't have a strong attachment to Kimberley. I started doing road trips through South Africa, and one of my first road trips, I arrived in Kimberley. It was Motzei Shabbos. It was Friday, it was Friday evening, and it had been raining. And I remember sitting in this Kimberley synagogue, which I'm going to get to later in the presentation, and it was one of the most incredible Jewish experiences ever. We just made a minyan, had these beautiful stained glass windows, and there was this thunderstorm. Rain is very rare in these parts. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've fallen in love with Kimberley. To prepare for this presentation, I recently went to Kimberley to do some research on the Jewish community there and on Kimberley itself. So basically, I think one, to understand not just South African Jewry, but the development of the South African economy is fundamentally linked to Kimberley and the discovery of diamonds in South Africa. Now, what's really interesting, have you all heard of Cecil John Rhodes? Yes. Okay. So the chief protagonist in this Kimberley story is certainly Cecil John Rhodes. But almost all of the supporting actors, all of the other main protagonists are Jewish and have a significant link to the development of the South African economy. When one thinks of diamonds today, we think of Antwerp in Belgium, London and Ramat Gan. We think of the Bukharan Jews, we think of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Antwerp, but the story and the Jewish link to Kimberley is just as strong. Today, Kimberley has 23 Jewish souls. This is a community which was very, very big in its heyday. The diamond industry is struggling today. You go to this beautiful little town of Kimberley and it's really depressed. There are potholes everywhere. The gardens are unkempt. The boom times are bust. But before we get to today, let's go back to the beginning. In my research for this, I found that Arthur Markowitz did a profile of the Kimberley Jewish community in 1947. And up until that day, in 1947, there are only 5 statues of people in Kimberley. Being a colonial town, because it's got a cathedral, one could imagine that there would be a statue of Queen Victoria and, of course, Cecil John Rhodes. The other 3 statues in 1947 were all of Jewish people. Alfred Beit, David Harris, and Gustav Klisser, who I'm going to get to 2 of them later. So, I mean, that for me is astonishing. One would expect the Queen to be there, but 3 of the 4 other statues were of Jewish people, and it just again shows to you back in 1947 how strong the Jewish link was to the city of Kimberley. So I'm now going to focus on three people who are critical in the story. Has anyone heard of David Harris? Okay. Have you heard of him?
Not that one.
Okay.
My brother happens to be a David Harris.
So I came across a 1931 article on David Harris, which referred to him as Colonel Sir David Harris, the grand old man of South African Jewry. I'm sure we all love that on our tombstones one day. And it's very important to understand this man. He grows up in Whitechapel. So this grand old man grows up on the wrong sides of the tracks in London. He's the son of a shopkeeper. He grows up in the East End. And what's very interesting, and I'm only going to be able to focus on one family, but a lot of the families who left their mark, not just on Kimberley, but on the South African economy, it wasn't just an individual, it was a group of family members. So, David Harris is the cousin of Barnett Isaacs, who we'll soon meet, and you'll probably know him by his other name. And Barnett's father was very generous because he'd give the boys boxing lessons, and which was very important in those tough neighborhoods in the East End. But in the school of hard knocks, David Harris wasn't very strong, and he'd get beaten up often, so he didn't focus much on sport. But importantly, he realized that he came from a very poor background, that he needed to work. So he got into a college, and he wasn't able to finish his schooling because he needed to get a job. And he started out as a merchant and as a bookkeeper. And when he was 16, he leaves London to go to Norwich. And there is a very kind gentleman who takes him in and spends 3 nights a week after hours in return for his work to train him in things like bookkeeping. He trains him how to read the classics like Shakespeare, to recite Shakespeare. And Harris, even though he comes from this underprivileged background, he soon becomes a cultured gentleman. And being a cultured gentleman, he reads the newspapers and he reads about the diamond fields in Kimberley. And he makes the decision to go there because his mother has given him a generous nest egg of 150 pounds. And he makes this trek from England, and he arrives at the port of Durban, which is very far. I mean, just think of it in those days. There's Durban on my right-hand side to Kimberley. There are no trains in those days, so he has to make the trip to the diamond fields via Oxwagon. And he arrives in this dust bowl, and instead of settling down, he realizes that he needs to be focused, that he needs to get rich quickly. So he meets another kind Jewish man, a Mr. Marcus Heyman, who employs him as a storeman. And he uses those skills from the days in Norwich. And whilst he's a general dealer, he realizes that he has to learn the art of diamond buying. Have you ever heard of the term a kopiedeveloper? Those were the middlemen of the diamond fields who would buy and then sell diamonds. So he realized that this is where the money needs to be made. And he's soon able to accumulate 400 pounds, and he would never ever gamble. He was this cultured gentleman. Even though he needed 400 pounds, he realized that he had to make more money. And business was a bit slow, and he betrays his values, the gentlemanly values, and he goes into a casino one day, into a gambling hall, and he soon makes 1,500 pounds. And this is critical to our story. He's then able to use that money to go back to London and go tell his family members that they were missing out, that they're on the cusp of greatness, that something's about to happen in Kimberley. They're starting to discover diamonds in Kimberley. The price of diamonds which they're being sold for isn't very high, and that there's a lot of money to be made. So he goes back to Kimberley to go inform his family members about it. And essentially what happens is that Harry Isaacs, Barnett's brother, is the first to join. He comes and he then convinces his Barnett to come, and Barnett comes in 1872. Immediately David Harris sees that Barnett is far more talented than Harry Isaacs, and he's actually very diffident. He's not really interested in his cousin Harry. But he builds up a very close relationship with Barnett, who becomes known as Barney. And Barney would come to David Harris's office daily and ask for advice, ask him how to get ahead, because he had that same motivation to succeed like David Harris. A big turning point for Barney is when he gets offered a stone for £150 and he negotiates the guy down to £120 and says, I'll pay you immediately, but then 5 minutes later says, actually the checkbook is locked in the vault, I'll only be able to pay for this later. He shares this news with David, who values the diamond at £300 and gives him a staggering £90 commission, which I think is very, very generous. He rewards his cousin. But what's good for David Harris is that he'll get rewarded many, many times in the future. So, David Harris might have had success in commerce, but his true success comes on the battlefield and in politics. Have you heard of Sir Charles Warren from, the Warren Shaft in Jerusalem? Okay, so he's a very famous excavator. So he served in some of the frontier wars in South Africa, and David Harris fights with him. And in the Bechuana Land Rebellion in 1896, he commands the forces and helps quash the rebellions. But Harris is what he's probably most remembered for, is what he did during the siege of Kimberley in the Anglo-Boer War. Now, according to the London Jewish Chronicle, Colonel Harris was the commander of the Kimberley Town Guard, and he planned all the fortifications around the mines and guarded the town. And it was largely due to him that the town didn't fall into the hands of the Boers, because he said to Rhodes and all the people who were in charge of Kimberley and the mines that if Kimberley would fall, there'd be an uprising in the Cape Colony and South Africa could have been lost to the British Empire. So what he did in Kimberley to keep Kimberley intact was absolutely critical. He knew the Boers would encircle the town, and he advised General Kekwich, who was leading the British charges, to do a military survey immediately. And De Beers helped provide the ammunitions and the provisions, and they're able to hold out. You go to the McGregor Museum in Kimberley, and it's a very jarring tale. And because of this, he got awarded the Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, which is like an OBE. In a 1900 article in the London Jewish Chronicle, there's an anecdote of when Harris was in Cape Town and he goes to Wynberg Hospital to visit a wounded Boer prisoner whose relatives he had known in happier times. The sentry over the prisoner was a huge guardsman who, responding to the kindly questions Harris, with his knowledge of the soldier's nature, had put to him, added, "Is it not strange, sir, that the prisoner, that the guard, and that you, his visitor, all of us are 3 Jews?" Which is very, very interesting, that you had Jews who fought for the Boers and Jews who fought for the British. I'm almost finished with David Harris. He entered politics in 1897 and he was an MP, and he introduced an amendment to the immigration law which recognized Yiddish in South Africa as a European language, which was very critical for Jews in those times, that the language of Yiddish was acknowledged. He had a 32-year record in Parliament, in those days by far the longest. What was also important about David Harris is he marries Rosa Gabriel, which was not only the first Jewish wedding in the Shul, but the first Jewish wedding in the whole Diamond Fields area. So that's David Harris. So basically now I want to move to his namesake, Barnett Isaacs. So there are 2 names who are principally associated with Kimberley. We all know Cecil John Rhodes, and we all know Barney Benato. Cecil John Rhodes, even though he had a country named after him, even though he was very generous with all the scholarships, the Oxford scholarships, the Rhodes scholarships, isn't so fondly remembered. Barney Benato, to this day, is recalled with good grace, is recalled as a great person. I mean, people speak about Barney Benato to this day with the most wonderful affection. And one will soon learn why. Not only did he have 2 names, he had about 2 or 3 dates of birth. I mean, he would change his dates of birth. When he arrived in the Diamonds Field, he said, "I share the date of birth with Cecil John Rhodes." And Barney, like his cousin David Harris, grows up on the wrong side of the tracks. He's a bit of a better boxer, but he's a short guy. So they didn't have much money, and they didn't want to be in the schmutzers business, so they were good acrobats. They started doing tricks. So it was his brother Harry and Barnett. And so how does he get the name Barney Benato? At the end of the performance, Harry would bow and Barney would forget. And people would go, and Barney too, which we get to Bernardo. So that was like at the end of every performance, Harry would bow, Barnett would forget. So that's how he gets the name Barney Bernardo. He arrives in Cape Town with very, very little money and a box of cigars. And he realizes that he has to make his way to Kimberley. And soon, so they have their box of cigars and a bag of acrobatic tricks. His personality makes up for his lack of size. He's a brilliant salesman. And he uses that spare time, instead of drinking, he uses it to learn as much as he can about the diamond industry. So he does his acrobatic acts during the day, but learns about the diamond industry at night. He meets up with a flamboyant Louis Cohn, and they start a company. And they start touring the diggings around the big hole, buying and selling stones. And whenever they do a deal, they take a swig of brandy and drink with the person who just bought the stones from them. And again, David Harris says, whenever you're short of funds, you come knock on my door and I'll help you. In 1876, there's a shortage of supply of diamonds. There's actually panic on the field. People are saying, is this the end of the diamond rush in Kimberley? What's going to happen next? Now, people start selling their rights because all the diamonds on the river, on the yellow ground, seem to have been extracted in Kimberley. Barney and his brother invest their entire life savings on the advice of a Dr. Atherston. Atherston claimed that diamonds would come from deeper underground and were formed and pushed to the surface in pipes. And remember, Barney's not educated, but he listens to this man who's far more intelligent than him. There are far more intelligent people than Barney who was far more intelligent players in the diamond field, but Barney listens to them, and he makes this decision to invest in what Atherston is predicting. So they invest £3,000 in 4 claims to the Kimberley mine, and they start buying more claims in outlying areas, but decide that instead of just buying cheap claims, that they need to focus on the city centre of Kimberley. Because as Whitechapel taught him, that you don't buy something just because it's cheap. You've got to rather use your money to focus on the value. So they start focusing on the depositories they think will extract the most value. And the future was in the blue soils of Kimberley, not the yellow surface. The boom times are now really about to begin, and they start buying more exhausted claims, and the Bernardo Diamond Company is formed in 1881. But what comes apparent is, and I don't know if it was the same with the story in Australia with mining, that you needed to amalgamate. You couldn't have all these different players competing with small claims. There could only be one person. They needed to achieve economies of scale. And we're going to leave Barney Bernardo for the minute, and I'm going to introduce you to Alfred Bite. Has anyone heard of him?
Yeah.
Bite Bridge in Zimbabwe? Okay. Bite has none of the theatrics and bravado of Bernardo and none of the military and political acumen of David Harris. But according to a financial journalist, J. Davenport, amalgamation is largely attributed to Cecil John Rose and Barney Bernardo. But one character that played an even more pivotal role in the shaping of the diamond fields was another Jewish person, Alfred Bite. He had deep pockets and great connections. If he had a cell phone today, he'd probably have about 4,000 contacts. This was a man who could make things happen. And he comes from the Hamburg merchant family, and he always used to refer to himself as, no, I'm one of the poorer merchant Bite families in Hamburg. He didn't come from a wealthy family. His parents couldn't send him to university, and he actually wasn't that intelligent. So he needed to get an apprenticeship. And he starts working as a junior clerk in a diamond cutting firm in Amsterdam. And all of a sudden, his employers realize that this man has a masterful memory and he's a brilliant sorter. He gets sent by Lippett's, a diamond buying office, to Kimberley at the tender age of 22. They realize this guy is a prodigy when it comes to sorting diamonds. And soon he makes this transition from being a sublime sorter to an incredible entrepreneur and the ultimate broker. He would say, buyers protected themselves against their own ignorance by offering generally 1/10 of what each stone was worth in Europe. Bite would soon have 2 businesses focused on diamond dealing and buying claims and properties. Rhodes would complain that Bite wasn't driven by capitalism. He said Bite, all he wanted to do was look after his mother. Bite soon joins another firm called the French Company, and they play a significant role because they have links to the Rothschild family. Like Rhodes and Bonato, Bite realized that there had to be amalgamation, and that operations had to be improved, and working costs had to be reduced. And what's interesting is that Bite decides to put his fortune put his bets with Cecil John Rhodes. And I always wonder whether they actually went to the same shul, because I mean, Barney Bonato was this Jewish macher in the town, the second biggest player in the diamond industry, but Alfred Bite decides to go with the colonial person Cecil John Rhodes. And it's interesting, I couldn't find the answer of whether Bite was integrally involved in the Jewish community. So whilst Rhodes was the tour de force, the chief financial officer was Bite. And it wouldn't have occurred, amalgamation would not have occurred if it wasn't for Bite's financial genius and his contacts in Europe. The history books remember Rhodes, but Rhodes would not have done what he did without his bosom buddy Bite. Bite had developed the grey matter, he was the shrewd negotiator and the visionary. So Bonato starts buying up smaller companies, and all what stood in his way for control of Kimberley was Bite and that French company, the company that links to Rothschild. If he could get hold of that, he'd get hold of all of Cecil John Rhodes' claims, and he would control Kimberley. But Bite helps Rhodes to get a Rothschild, who was the major backer of the French company. And soon, Rothschilds agreed that Rhodes and De Beers should buy this French company for £1.4 million, and Barney Bonato says, no, I'll offer you £1.7 million. And Bonato's company would then have sufficient stake to also take over De Beers. Eventually what happens is De Beers buys the French company on condition that it gets sold to Bonato. So Cecil John Rhodes and Alfred Bite make sure that De Beers, which is Rhodes' company, buys the French company, and then it gets sold on to Bonato's company in return for £300,000. But this would mean, and this is what Bite did, that they would also now have shares in Bonato's company. So, but at this stage, Barney Bonato has control of Kimberley. But soon, what do you think is going to happen now? Soon, Bite gets his European backers to start buying shares in Central. And the share price goes up from 14 to 49 pounds, and Bonato's backers start to panic. Surely, I mean, we're backing our friend Barney Bonato now, but now our shares are worth 49 pounds. Let's sell those shares. I mean, we're onto a fortune. Bonato is no longer secure, and essentially, I'm now going to bring in another Jewish person quickly called Sarah Gertrude Millen, a Jewish writer. There aren't sadly that many Jewish female players in this Jewish story of Kimberley, but Sarah Millen is one of them. And this is what she says. When, for instance, this was during the negotiation with Rhodes. Who wants to read for me? Do you want to read for me? You can just read this. Okay, yes. So this is when Rhodes and Bonato were negotiating during the amalgamation.
When, for instance, there was the question as to who should control the diamond mines, he or the East End Jew Barney Bonato, Rhodes played one of his trump cards, membership of the Kimberley Club. For Bonato might be a millionaire, he might buy a house in Park Lane. He might, in the year whose end was to see also the end of Rhodes' triumphant ascent, avert through his dealings a panic on the London Stock Exchange. He could not, until Rhodes' work had achieved what a man who had an old England behind him found waiting in his path. He could not get into the little iron-roofed Kimberley Club.
Okay, so
That hasn't changed
No.
much.
okay.
Now,
So you're aware of clubs. So at the end of the day, Rhodes and Bonato would go for lunch every single day, and Bonato wasn't a member of the Kimberley Club. He wanted to be a member of the Kimberley Club. Rhodes got to change the laws of the Kimberley Club. They said you're only allowed to visit her once a month, but he would go there every single day. the end of the day, the deal was over 4 things. 1, that he would make Barney Bonato a member of Parliament. Number 2, that he would become a life governor of De Beers Consolidated. Number 3, that he would get a membership. Barney Bonato would be given membership to the Kimberley Club. And number 4, obviously they had to negotiate about money. So Cecil John Rhodes says, I can guarantee you I'll make you a member of Parliament. I can guarantee you I'll make you a life governor of De Beers, but I cannot guarantee you membership of the Kimberley Club. Eventually they get to do the deal. And 2 things, and one of them might be an urban legend, is that the deal was that he'd get membership, he gets given membership of Kimberley Club. The 4th was that Bonato pushed a bucket of diamonds across the table towards him, and the diamonds, it was a curved table, the diamonds fell onto his lap, or fell onto the floor next to Bonato. And essentially the deal was done. For that, this is in the 1880s for just under £5.4 million. That's what the deal was, and Bonato did actually very, very well out of that. So that's another significant thing in Kimberley jury, and thanks, you read very, very well there. So, does anyone know how Barney Bonato dies?
He fell overboard.
Okay, so this is an incredible story. He wasn't doing so well, he was depressed, and he decided to go back with his wife and his cousin, Solly Joel, back to Britain. And remember, there's a family link, so not only are the Harrises linked to the Bonatos are also linked to the Joels. So Barney Bonato falls overboard on the ship sailing back to the United Kingdom. And the coroner declared that it was suicide, but I've seen a lot of reports which believe that Solly Joel murdered his cousin, Barney Bonato. It's never proved. There are witnesses who said they saw that Solly was in a scuffle, that when Barney fell overboard, it took them time. They got to him in time, and it was almost as if they were pushing him down. You could say it's an urban legend, but it was interesting that 9 months after Barney Bonato dies, Wolf Joel, Solly's only brother, gets killed by a German extortionist. And after that, Solly Joel controls the finances of the family. So, because there was no other Bonato, then there was a Bonato wife. But that's Solly Joel wasn't a very nice man. Even with his kids, he didn't share the money. So that's the story of Barney Bonato.